Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
Well said.
Thank you.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another, and Damien is up this week. So what are you bringing to the table today, my friend?
Oh, you. I have not brought you. I have brought an article from Hammer and Hope.
I brought myself.
Yes, you brought yourself. Mm-hmm. I brought an article from Hammer and Hope's newest issue to the table for us, their second issue. And I'm so excited about this because I'm just such a fan of Hammer and Hope. I appreciate what they produce, what they publish. I think it's all so well done, and I feel like we've already learned so much from them.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to have this conversation today. The piece I've brought to the table is called "The Supreme Court Shouldn't Get the Last Word." And it was,
Indeed.
Absolutely. Spoiler alert. And it was written by Braxton Brewington, who is a community organizer and a spokesperson for the Debt Collective, which is obviously an organization we've talked a lot about here on the pod. But I thought this was a really great thought piece. I thought it was a pointed, it was a pointed exploration of the current state of the Supreme Court in this country and the dangers that the Supreme Court presents to our society. And I think certainly to our collective humanity and to our collective liberation. He uses some of the court's most recent rulings for context, including their ruling just earlier this year about the HEROES Act and Joe Biden's student debt relief plan to make clear the case for what we should consider and do as it relates to the future of the court, right? And so this was a pretty lengthy piece. There's a lot in it. I think it was really well done. So I'm excited to talk to you about it. You know, what did you think? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought it was great. And it spoke a lot to, I think, what I've been thinking about the Supreme Court. Some of what we talked about a few months ago, whenever that was.
Oh, gosh.
When we talked about some of their decisions over the last year or so. He names that the public confidence in the court is lower than ever, or close to lower than ever. He included the so-called liberal justices writing very critical dissents of these rulings.
Scathing dissents in a lot of cases.
And Kagan specifically said that the court is a danger to democratic order when they ruled against a racial gerrymandering case in I don't remember where now.
Gosh.
Yeah, I lost that. But that was part of the dissent that she wrote. He also points out corruption of the court that stems from a decision it made about 15 years ago with Citizens United. He asks the very pertinent question that if the court is based in all this corruption and the majority is subscribed to fringe legal theories or manipulating legal precedent and protocol, then do we need to take them seriously?
Yeah.
Does the executive branch or the legislative branch need to take them seriously? Can they ignore their orders and, in fact, start fighting back against their decisions and corruption with their own actions?
Right.
Whether that's executive actions or court reform or what have you.
Right.
So I think this article is a really great and wide-ranging view of a ton of the issues of the court and gives a really good sort of bird's eye view of all of those things going on that you could obviously probably dive in deep into each one of those things, but it's a really great overview of all of it.
Yeah, I think there's just like a myriad of issues with our Supreme Court, and this piece does such a great job in sort of giving us that view of them. It's really kind of wild, I think, to think about all of the issues that are at play.
Yeah.
With when you think about what the Supreme Court is supposed to be, right? This sort of quote unquote cornerstone institution of our democracy, of our legal system, right? And so to that point, Braxton Brewington said this about the Supreme Court. I highlighted this and I wanted to bring it. Quote, according to the liberal democratic ideal, the Supreme Court is supposed to call balls and strikes, an umpire ensuring that everyone plays by the legal rules. While the court has never been a neutral arbiter of justice, today it plays pitcher and batter too. 3 of the court's justices were scandalously brought onto the bench by a president who lost the popular vote and were confirmed by a Senate body that's disproportionately skewed by Republican votes. votes. Since then, they have carried out a deeply harmful political agenda, overturning well-settled laws that did everything from protecting labor unionizing to protecting the environment. The court has recently escalated its use of the shadow docket, which, as Stephen Vladeck writes, sinisterly makes new laws that advance conservative agendas while shielding themselves from scrutiny or having to fully engage with a case's merits. We can see this dynamic of corruption, disregard for ethics, and an unhinged conservative political agenda play out clearly with the ruling striking down student loan debt. And so I like it, that section sort of stopped me in my tracks. I thought it was scathing, but it's a scathing, but I think accurate assessment of the Supreme Court and its sort of role in threatening our democracy. And as I sort of mentioned at the top, like our collective liberation, when you think about the cases that have been presented to it over these past several years.
Yeah. And it's, when did the Trump justices come in? So it's been...
Well, now it would have been 3-4 years, right?
Yeah. So that majority that the conservative bloc has had over the court has done a whole lot of stuff.
A whole lot, right? Absolutely.
So, yeah. And what you pulled and just lays out all of it really quickly. And
Absolutely.
I love that.
Yeah.
One piece that I highlighted was about how the right is basically ignoring court rulings they don't like anyway.
Yeah.
This is what the article said, quote, conservatives have made it plain that they will respect the judiciary only until the moment it threatens their power. So in the face of the Supreme Court's assault on basic civil rights, from undermining education to gutting reproductive health care to hampering democracy, why should the left succumb to the harsh reign of judicial supremacy?
I love that you pulled that quote because that's the next part from the quote I read. Like, yes.
Yeah. And, you know, Braxton was writing specifically about how Kay Ivey, governor of Alabama, basically told the courts that the legislature of Alabama knows better about how to draw a map for the electoral districts and refused to create a second black majority district on the map, which is what the order said.
Right.
And this reminds me of all of the ways that conservatives refuse to comply with Brown v. Board and other decisions as well throughout history in that particularly like 50s, 60s, 70s, where the court
time frame,
did some progressive-ish things, at least progressive for the time.
For the time, right.
And, you know, they refused to desegregate their schools and eventually just ensured that while it was legally desegregated, the actual lived reality is still hugely segregated.
Yeah.
And so if we have this history of the court handing down these decisions and the right-wing people saying like, no, we don't have to do this until it gets enforced by the DOJ or by, you know, a executive branch by a president who's like, no, you have to do this. This is the law of the land. You know, why do we need to then follow through and say that this is how it works for this?
Absolutely.
You know, one side's playing by the rules and the other side's like, nah, we don't need to do that.
Yeah, when it's convenient for them to not do so. Yeah. The Alabama situation was wild to me. I can't believe I really didn't know much about that ruling until reading this piece. Like, but I don't understand. I can't sort of fathom how this Alabama governor, the Republican leadership in that state, just can ignore a Supreme Court ruling. I don't know. I feel like if I was somehow in front of the Supreme Court, I, as Damien, would have to follow whatever the Supreme Court said. So I don't understand how it's possible. It's just crazy to me. So, but yeah, it's a great point. I love the connection to sort of other rulings you referenced, Brown versus Board of Education. Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. One of the things that Braxton does in this piece, which I think is kind of brilliant, is he asks a very valid question. And I think given sort of the Alabama situation and really all of the troublesome rulings that the Supreme Court has made recently, I think this is like I said, a really valid question. He talks about and highlights this in this piece, and it's sort of all of the sort of shady financial dealings of some of the Supreme Court justices, right? And I know this is something you want to talk about too. I just know it's in your bones to talk about this. Yeah. So I pulled this quote that Braxton said to sort of kick us off with this quote: "The Supreme Court's rulings and the cases it hears aren't random. They are the deliberate outcome of a world in which billionaires can bring cases before the justices they bribe. Justice Clarence Thomas has had secret financial arrangements with right-wing billionaire Harlan Crow, accepting luxury super yacht trips and private jet flights from Crow virtually every year without disclosing them. Justice Samuel Alito took grand trips funded by the conservative billionaire Paul Singer, a GOP megadonor who has repeatedly asked the Supreme Court to rule in his favor in high-stakes business disputes. That's reported by ProPublica. Crow and Singer each had ties to the lawsuit that halted student debt relief.
No way.
Yeah, among other businesses before the court. For decades, a gang of billionaires, I love that he says a gang of billionaires, have purchased access to the Supreme Court, including GOP contributor David Sokol, who 4 months before oral arguments in Biden versus Nebraska were even heard, foretold in a speech that relief would be overturned by the Supreme Court. And so it's infuriating. It's a lot of things to think about, sort of the ways in which, rich, wealthy, white people in the majority are able to sort of influence the court's actions, its decisions, when it's supposed to be, as I said earlier, like this cornerstone of our democracy and sort of looking out for all of us. It's clearly not doing that.
No, it's not accountable to us
At all.
Yeah, and I think you said he called them a gang of billionaires. I don't know that that's what the collective noun for like what a group of billionaires is. I haven't thought of what one could be yet. So
that's our plan for tonight.
if any of you listening have a good idea for that, comment on social media, post wherever, and we'll find a way to share out our favorites at a later date.
I love that.
So yeah, that's our team building exercise for the day. What is the collective noun for a group of billionaires? Gang is a good entry.
Gang is great. Yeah,
it just feels incomplete.
Yes.
No disrespect to Braxton Brewington at all either. So let's talk about Citizens United, which I think leads to
about this money.
Some of this money stuff that you just talked about.
Yeah.
Braxton writes about some of the ways that Alito and Thomas both accepted gifts from billionaires, as you just said,
right,
and then participated in cases that were connected to their business interests of those billionaires.
Don't understand.
Yeah.
Like the conflict of interest is slapping you in the face.
Yeah, and they just don't care.
Yeah.
So he said, quote, "These unethical dark money activities come as little shock, given that more than a decade ago, the Supreme Court, the only federal judges not bound by a code of conduct, gave billionaires and corporations a green light to funnel unlimited amounts of funds into elections via the Citizens United decision." So, after that decision, there are now no limits to contributions via political action committees and other ways that you can take to hide how much money billionaires and corporations spend and hide who's spending that money, where that money's coming from.
Yep.
And this is such a huge change in the ways that campaign finance worked that the super wealthy can now contribute basically whatever they want to whomever they want and drive a super fringe agenda in our country just because the court decided that money is somehow protected free speech.
Ooh, wow. Yes. Yes.
Which, in an economy that sets up so-called winners and losers is a wild thing to say. Oh, well, you get a bigger voice because your money is speech too.
Yes.
Like that's just stupid.
Yep.
And as Braxton Brewington said, the courts don't have a code of conduct. The Supreme Court does not have a code of conduct. So they can accept those gifts, not report them until someone in the media figures it out, pressures them into reporting it, calls them out on it publicly. But clearly they're not accountable to the regular people in this country. They have no idea what it is that we want, but they've amassed this power, to quote Kagan again, to become the arbiter of political disputes for all of us.
For all of us. Yeah.
And it, especially considering this part of the corruption, the way that they're using the shadow docket to drive further agendas, some of the legal theories that they seem to subscribe to, they're so disconnected from the vast majority of the country that it's very hard to reconcile for me why it is that they get to continue to lead lifetime appointments.
Yeah, yeah. And make these huge decisions that have impacts on real people in our lives, right? And you talk about them being disconnected from us. They're disconnected from us and our lived experiences and what's really happening. And there's no way you can tell me that, if a billionaire gives you a yacht, if a billionaire gives you a vacation, if a billionaire gives you millions of dollars, that you aren't influenced by what it is that their agenda is and what it is that they want. It's wild to me that the Supreme Court and these justices don't have a code of conduct. Like, there's a code of conduct for all of us regular people in our normal everyday job. There are things I know I can and cannot do at work. Why is that not the case as a Supreme Court justice? And so, it's easy, I think, to see how then this corruption can exist. And there's no one checking that. I mean, even as you talk about the reporters reporting on it, I still don't think anything's been done with the reporting that's happened about Thomas and Alito and others. And so...
Also Gorsuch and Kavanaugh as well.
Yes.
Who I think Gorsuch was trying to sell a piece of property that was on the market for a long, long time. And then all of a sudden it was bought for over market price by one of these people.
Yeah.
And then Kavanaugh had a bunch of debt that just disappeared.
It just
disappeared. He doesn't have a way to explain. Well before he was a justice, but
still, now you are, right? And so there should be some measure of accountability and some sort of some standard with which you conduct yourself as a Supreme Court justice. And so, I think this was such a central point of this piece, I think, and others like it that I know are out there, right? Like, we have to make the point loud and clear that something has to be done to stop this, to change this, because I think otherwise the court is going to continue to harm real people by the decisions that it gets to make.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Absolutely.
Hey, Damien.
Hey, Aaron.
You know what's coming up?
What's that?
At least once this unseasonable heat wave ends.
Okay.
It's my favorite season.
Ooh.
The fall of the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. October.
Yes.
And with that comes some cooler temperatures, and as the cool kids call it, sweater weather or hoodie season.
I love sweater weather. That's right. This is the best season, the fall, as you call it. If you didn't know, folks listening, we've got a merch store where you can get a hoodie for the fall.
Indeed.
In fact, we've got lots of great apparel for the fall. We've got a few hoodies on our site, a long sleeve shirt, a nice pair of jogger pants, and even a mug for your hot cocoa or whatever you want to put in that thing.
Indeed. And if you buy something now with promo code 15 off, that's 150FF, you'll get 15% off your total purchase. And you can use that code up until October 31st. So go ahead and get cozy for spooky season.
Hashtag spooky season. I love it. Just visit our website, interdependentstudy.com, and click the merch link on the top menu, and you'll be transported directly to our store. And don't forget to use the promo code 15 off.
Man, I can't wait to see all this merch out there in the wild.
I love it. Well, let's formally move ourselves into application here, though, because I feel like we're in it. All right. We're talking about it, right? This is the part of the podcast, if you're new to us, where we talk about how this article and our thoughts and our conversation about it apply to our daily lives. There's a quote I pulled that I thought would be some good application here. Braxton said this, quote, "Whether it's the Supreme Court's demolition of democracy and preserving gerrymandering, upholding of creditocracy by dismantling student debt relief, or blessing of structural oppression by ending affirmative action, these anti-democratic decisions are growing too common. People like me, a young non-white voter in a swing state, need a response from the executive branch motivated by a deep sense of moral righteousness equivalent to the scale of harm currently being inflicted." And I don't know, I felt like that was just a really sort of poignant summary of what's happening with the court, the dangerous impact that it's having on all of us, on our society, on our collective humanity, our possibility for collective liberation, and especially given the stats mentioned in this piece around, and you said this at the top, like how many Americans lack confidence in the Supreme Court. I think it's something that we all need to be concerned about, right? We all need to be attuned to, and we have to figure out how we invest in, as Braxton sort of asks in this piece, like, what does the future of the Supreme Court look like? What should be done to sort of fix this, if you will? So, yeah, that's my application. What were you thinking?
Yeah. Real quick, the public confidence in the Supreme Court as of June 2022.
Okay.
I don't see a number for 2023.
Huh.
But Gallup reported in June 2022, 25%
Wow.
of Americans have confidence in the Supreme Court.
Yep.
Down from 36% in 2022.
Gosh, which wasn't all that high to begin with.
No,
Yeah.
it's not. So That's fun.
Yep. That's where we are.
Yeah. My application this week is something called popular constitutionalism,
Oh, yeah.
which Braxton Brewington wrote about.
Yes.
I think this is a key concept that I would like to learn more about.
Yeah.
But that we need the executive branch to begin adopting because the makeup of the court is unlikely to change over the next several years. And I doubt that the legislative branch will ever have its stuff together because it has its own problems,
Issues.
Speaker of the House,
Yeah.
enough to make reforms of the court. Like the legislative branch isn't the branch that has its stuff together enough to do anything
Exactly.
about any of this. So I guess it's up to popular resistance to these rulings and pressure from that popular resistance on the executive branch to ignore unjust rulings and push for political actions in opposition to them.
Yes.
Which there is some history of too.
Yes.
Braxton Brewington wrote about. Progressive organizers need movement on these kinds of things and will now need to push for this kind of executive level disobedience, which on the one hand feels like a great stance to take in terms of one branch standing up to another one that has taken off in a direction that isn't a positive direction for the country
at all.
And I also feel like it's something we need to be very careful with, because the authoritarian creep we're seeing in state and local governments across the country and the way that elections work in this country, meaning that, a couple of swing states swing in a certain direction and you take a bunch of people off voter rolls and all of a sudden we're now talking about, maybe not Trump, but somebody
Trump
else
presidency
who's a more competent version of Trump, which, using this kind of a lever in the executive branch would create a lot of havoc, I think. So there's a lot of caution I also have
I think
with this for it being a wide-ranging thing. I think if there's some specific focused ways that would happen, maybe that's the right direction to go. But I'm also a little bit nervy about it, just given what Trump was able to do when he was in office.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't think we would see the day where someone like Trump would become president of the United States, and we see the impact of his presidency as we're talking about the Supreme Court and the justices he was able to get on it. And so, I think that's a good sort of application of thinking about how we can influence and pressure the executive branch to do something about this, but where's the line? What does that look like? What are the restraints? What are the conditions for that work? I appreciate that. All right, let's talk about homework. What do we want to do when we leave the table today to continue our learning, but to also do things like think about what a collective of billionaires is? So that's one piece of homework for sure. I mentioned earlier that I hadn't really heard about that Alabama case, and so it makes me want to learn more about some of the other Supreme Court cases referenced in this piece that I hadn't heard about or don't know much about. That certainly includes reading up about this Alabama situation. It also includes learning more about the Supreme Court's ruling that overturned a law that protected labor unionizing, especially as we've been talking about labor unions here recently and #hot labor summer. So I just think it's important to, as we continue to have these other conversations, where I'm thinking about the application that you just presented, it's important to know everything that the Supreme Court is doing and is ruling on. And it's important just to be up on all of that. So that's my homework. What about you?
Yeah, I think that the labor unionizing thing he was referring to was the reversal of labor unions being able to collect dues from their members automatically. There's a better word for it than automatic, but that's I think that's what he was referring to.
But I think the brief thing I saw was that that's a sort of, it was a long-standing law.
Oh,
right?
Yeah,
It was a
yeah.
long-standing sort of set law, and boom, here we are.
Yeah. Well, so my homework is I want to learn more about the shadow docket and all the ways that the court is using that to subvert attention, like dodge attention and dodge criticism while still creating rulings. I think that this existed for a pretty boring procedural reason, but it's been manipulated into being something much bigger than it was originally intended to be. But I don't really know much more about it than that. So I think this seems like a really critical piece of the puzzle in terms of how the court is choosing to operate at the moment, because they're using it to their advantage in ways that subvert and circumvent sort of the public eye.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah. Oh, wow. We've got a lot of learning to do. Huh?
Yeah.
I like it. All right. Well, this feels like a good place to stop our conversation and to think about next week. So you, my friend, are up next time. What are you bringing to the table for our next episode?
Well, our next episode, I'm bringing our next book.
Oh, yes.
It's called Say Her Name. It's written by Kimberly Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum. And I pulled this quote from Haymarket's website about the book. Say Her Name provides an analytical framework for understanding Black women's susceptibility to police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. And it explains how, through Black feminist storytelling and ritual, we can effectively mobilize various communities and empower them to advocate for racial justice. So I'm well into this book.
Yeah.
But it's really hard read.
Yes.
Because there are stories from mothers and siblings of women who have been killed by the police. And it's a lot.
Yes.
It's a lot to witness their pain even through this book.
Yes.
But I'm bringing this because I think it's important that we recognize how often Black women become victims of police violence and are often viewed as disposable in these situations with police, because there are so many names on the cover of this book, honestly, that some of which I know and remember, but a lot that we don't know collectively, and they weren't picked up in the same way that names of other victims of police violence have been picked up,
Right.
To become common knowledge, to have their stories become widespread.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's important to tell these stories and to know these stories because they mattered.
Yes.
And they were treated like they didn't matter.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to understand these stories, understand how the system works to be able to do anything about it.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we're talking about this book. And I think you and I have said this to each other on 2 separate occasions about how difficult of a read it has been, right? There have been multiple chapters reading these sort of tellings of these women, their stories, their upbringing, their lives, that have just brought me to tears.
Yeah. The people they leave behind.
The people they
too.
leave behind. And I love the ways in which their mothers, their siblings have talked about who they were as people, their affect, what they loved doing. And so it's important. It's important to know that about a person because we all have that. I think about if I were to go, how you would talk about me. Like, we have that. And so, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been difficult to get through. But the point of the book is so important. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you've forgotten, please follow us, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on the socials, including YouTube and TikTok, and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.